So I'm so grateful to have Reverend Kelli here today with us. Kelli is the assistant minister over at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis, FUS, where her portfolio includes social justice and pastoral care. And she also serves as a quarter-time minister for the St. Croix Unitarian Fellowship, known as SIGUS, in Wisconsin. She is a fellow alumni of United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities and the former executive director of the Minnesota Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, RCRC. She worked as a training consultant for the national office of RCRC, educating clergy from around the country for pastoral care around reproductive decisions and reproductive loss. I attended one of those sessions many, many years ago and remember it vividly. She also managed FUS's role as a plaintiff in a lawsuit that successfully challenged restrictions to abortion access. Her primary spiritual practice is a glorious art play that she's been practicing for years and sometimes shows us online her wonderful artwork. So thank you, Kelli.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I am delighted to continue sharing this message. I want to start with a reading that I wrote for the Unitarian Universalist Association when they were asking for resources around reproductive health, rights, and justice for a service just like this. I titled it, "Learn to Tell Your Story." My most impactful life decisions in chronological order: to have abortions when I needed them, to get sober, to give birth to our child. If each life is precious, then so is mine, and so is hers, and so is yours. I'm not ashamed, nor do I regret my abortions. Rather, I am grateful for access to abortion care by professional and compassionate providers, and the opportunity to, as Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison says, to captain my own ship. What I wish for all of us, and especially for my daughter's generation, is robust reproductive health, justice, and freedom without stigma or restriction. An end to heteronormative, patriarchal, white supremacy culture, and love and liberation in abundance. I've been doing this work for, as Laura said, for quite a long time, and it was in seminary that I began to understand that I could combine a faith expression and pro-choice. I didn't think you could do that, right? How could you be pro-faith and pro-choice? But I found the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and it was as if I'd walked into a room full of folks of like mind who were wrestling with what does it mean to be pro-choice and pro-faith. And to not, what I've learned over the years is not to engage the faith conversation in the way that the anti-choice folks do, but to find my own path through it. I don't have any interest in arguing with someone who is, I'll say, so-called pro-life. I am not unbiased. I'm very biased. I have my position. And so I'll be in conversation with people, but I don't need to convince somebody who is quite sure that life begins at conception. If that's someone's perspective, that's fine. Anyone can have that, and that may be some of you. I want to recognize that in this room, there are lots of different perspectives on this. I just want to tell you where I'm at. I think the opposition to full reproductive health rights and justice has been incredibly successful. Obviously, with the Dobbs decision that has overturned Roe v. Wade, and the way that abortion rights and access is talked about in this country. You don't have to get very far down in any article to get to when does life begin. That is one way to be in that conversation. And I want to say that there are lots of other ways to be in that conversation. What does it mean to be human? It means that we have choices in our lives. What does it mean to have sovereignty in our bodies? To captain our own ship, to get to chart those waters? Those are interesting theological questions that I have spent some time on. I'm going to spend a tiny bit of time on that today, and also want to talk about what can we do in this moment. I could go on for hours, and I promise you I'm not going to. I'll just start off, I'll come back to that point. My answer to when does life begin is that life began on this planet some 3.5 billion years ago. I think I'm right on that date. Someone could challenge me on that. Life began on this planet 3.5 billion years ago, and every organism is some flowering on that tree of life. And nature creates with abundance. In every place we look in nature, far more organisms begin than come to maturity. Far more organisms begin than come to maturity. I am really captivated by this gorgeous bouquet here today. It's so lovely, and I saw you taking your time to craft it just so for us. Thank you for that beauty. The seeds that come from these plants, there are many, many, many more seeds that come from mature plants than ever become plants themselves, right? Nature creates with abundance, and not every organism comes to maturity. That's the cycle of life. So those are a couple of things I say about when does life begin. The question of when personhood begins, I think, is incredibly subjective. So I'm going to say something to you that is very subjective, and you can test it against the other things you've heard from other religions that proclaim that life begins at a certain moment. Personhood, I believe, for me and my child, considering my own reproductive life, began at a moment of covenant. Began at the moment that I created a covenant with that pregnancy. I've had at least 4 pregnancies, 2 abortions, at least 1 miscarriage, and a child who is 20 years old, and the light of my life. Here's how I think about this. My first abortion and my miscarriage happened at almost exactly the same moment, about 12 weeks. And the procedure which followed those incidents was almost exactly the same. It was a D&C. The only thing in my own body, the only thing that was different was how I felt about those pregnancies. That I had made a covenant with one that I very much wanted and one that I did not want. So what's the difference? It's about covenant to me. Now, is that completely subjective to every single one of us here? Perhaps. Is it any less subjective than a religion based on ancient stories and tellings saying to you, we have the one truth and the light, and life begins at not a scientific moment. Personhood begins not at a scientific moment, but the moment of conception or implantation. They don't even know what they mean. That's completely subjective too. You tell me, no, that's subjective. It's more difficult because it invites us to be in a conversation of what covenant, parenthood, personhood means. And that's the very precise reason that we don't get to tell somebody else how they create their own families. That's the exact reason we don't get to tell someone else how they create their own families. I'll be interested to hear what you think about that. I'm testing out this idea. I want to talk now, and I'll move a little more into maybe some real specifics. I want to lift up some language that you may or may not have heard. One is called prim pregnancies. The people who think that there should be some ability for people to have abortions based on specific circumstances. Those circumstances are called prim. Is short for prenatal issue, rape, incest, or the health of the mother. Prenatal issue of the fetus, rape, incest, or maternal health, prim. Okay? So you may hear folks say, well, I don't think it should be for everybody all the time, but in certain circumstances, and usually they mean those circumstances, it's okay, right? That's about a quarter of all abortions that happen in the country. What that means is that people are seeking abortion care for lots of other reasons besides that have to do with, in my case, I was simply not ready to be a parent. I was an active alcoholic at the time. I knew that parenting was one of the most important things that I would ever do, and I didn't want to do it wrong. But I don't need to give an excuse or check anybody's boxes to say that. Pregnancy is biology. Parenting is a covenantal commitment. So let me talk a little bit. So when you hear people talk about it's okay for some abortions to happen and others, you may want to, and you're thinking about that conversation in your own head. What do you think is okay? Only these, not these? Who decides? How do we decide? And I want to share with you the concept of reproductive justice. Reproductive justice was articulated by Black women in the mid-90s, led by Loretta Ross. There's an article in today's Star Tribune in which I am quoted, and it says, as Kelli Clement calls it, reproductive justice. I didn't call it that. Black women articulated this frame, and they were in response to pro-choice. It's not the right time in my life. I have to finish my college education. A reasonable reason to have an abortion if that's what you choose to do, versus there are all kinds of intersectional issues in my life that mean it's not a stable time for me to parent. So reproductive justice lifts up 3 human rights: the right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. The right to have children, the right to not have children, and the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments. So when we work on environmental issues or gun safety or economic security or mass incarceration, any of those things, they intersect with reproductive justice, right? So I found that in my work with Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, we did not often find congregations that wanted us to be that number one issue, was to work on repro rights. But when you are working on these other things, I want to remind you that you are working for reproductive justice. And if those questions aren't automatically coming up, to make that connection. When you're thinking about environmental issues, try to make that connection for reproductive justice or food security or gun safety or all those other things. Okay, I want to say some things about where we are in Minnesota right now and what we can do. So Laura mentioned the lawsuit. There was a lawsuit that was filed in 2019. It was just decided this summer, just a couple of weeks after the Dobbs decision came down. First Unitarian Society was originally a party to the lawsuit. Toward the end, we were asked to step back as a plaintiff for a legal maneuver, and we did that, and the lawsuit prevailed. So in Minnesota, we have a stronger protection by a constitutional ruling than we do in the US Constitution. There was a 1995 case called Doe v. Gomez, and Doe v. Gomez said that Minnesotans have not only the right to have an abortion, but the right to decide to have an abortion without the government putting its thumb on the scale, right? The government is not allowed to privilege one pregnancy outcome over another. That's why Minnesota Care does pay for abortion care, not at the rate that it should, but we are one of the few states where public health dollars can be used for abortion care. There were all these laws in Minnesota, on the books in Minnesota, that had gotten passed, and we made a challenge to them based on that Doe decision, okay? So things like a 24-hour waiting period, a script that doctors had to read that was medically inaccurate, that minors under 16 years old had to get permission from both of their parents, whether or not they had a relationship with both of those parents, in order to get an abortion. By the way, a minor does not need permission to give birth, just so you know. That physicians only could provide abortion care, both surgical and medical, and that doctors faced felony penalties if they went against any of these, if they broke any of these laws. And those laws were struck down because of our lawsuit. So in Minnesota, there is no more 24-hour waiting period. That need for minors to get approval from their parents, gone. Advanced practice clinicians can provide abortion care. And the felony penalties are removed, which means that hospitals and other clinics will be more able to provide abortion care. Before, it was only 5 abortion clinics in the state that would do it, and part of that had to do with those felony penalties, right? So now, Minnesota is a receiving state, as our abortion laws are obviously much better than some other places in the country. And so we're receiving people from Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, Texas, Louisiana, Missouri, all over the country who are coming here for abortion care. Okay. So I'm going to say a word about what we can do and what we should not assume that we can do. I get asked this a lot. What can we do right now? Can we create a so-called underground railroad to help people get to abortion clinics? Can we provide safe houses? Can we provide transportation and that sort of thing? It is a really good impulse, I think, to want to do that. And I'll tell you why it's not a great idea for us to do so. There are people who are already doing this work. Abortion funds in Minnesota and around the country are doing really, really great work, and I'll share some resources again. People sometimes travel with their families. They need to be housed in hotels. They need to be in places that they know are COVID safe. They need to be in places where they're not going to face perhaps microaggressions because of race. And those sorts of things. And so the best thing that we can do in our open-heartedness is to support the organizations that are already doing the work. Our Justice, our Justice is the statewide abortion fund, and they do incredible work doing organizing, getting people from other states to here, providing transportation, providing lodging and access to the procedure itself. So one of the best things you can do is hold a house party and raise some funds for Our Justice. Or some of the other organizations. There's some great organizations, and again, I'll name them. Unrestrict Minnesota, Unrestrict MN, does tremendous advocacy work. They led the charge on the lawsuit, and so they are working now with a Reproductive Justice Freedom Caucus, Reproductive Freedom Caucus in the Minnesota House and the Minnesota Senate. So here's the most important things we can do in this electoral season. I'm not going to talk to you about candidates, but I'm going to say that you want to talk to your candidates and not assume that they're pro-choice because they have been in the past, but ask them directly, what are you going to do to protect abortion rights in Minnesota? Are you a member of the Minnesota Reproductive Freedom Caucus? If not, why not? Get them on the record. And if you are in a district where you are represented by someone who is not pro-choice, have them on the record. What will you do to protect reproductive rights in Minnesota? Because now they're saying, oh, it's the law of the land, it won't change. So get them on the record and have them saying that. Okay, that is a lot. I want to say one more thing, and then I'm going to open it for a little dialogue. And if we went...
Because we have a 11:45.
Oh, yeah, you have a... Yeah, okay. Yeah. I'll stick around and you can talk a little bit. Here's another thing. I want to say one more thing about what we can do. If you have a story of your own abortion that you can share, and it is safe to do so, learn to tell your story. It's healing for you, and it's healing for the people who hear it. I'm not asking you to tell it in the public square, but if you can share it, do so. I'm going to ask us also to think about changing our language. For years, we said safe, legal, and rare. That word rare carries stigma. I'll be 60 years old next month. I had 2 abortions, and it was only this year that I put the S on that and talked about them in the plural. Because the rare made me feel stupid. 1 might have been okay, but 2, rare creates stigma. And so now what I say is I want abortion safe, legal, and accessible. This is up to all of us. I thank you for letting me chatter at you for a while. I'll stick around and chat afterwards. All blessings on your work and your continued ministry here, and for being this organization in this part of the city. You are much needed. Thank you.